So first of all, my fellow editors, Sally Archibald and Norman Owen Smith, they could unfortunately not be here today, but they were basically the three of us worked as a team, together with all the lead authors that you see at the bottom of this slide. So the lead authors of the chapters, but there were many, many more authors involved, so this is a list of all the authors. So I did not count them, but I think it's about 30, 40 different people from many different places. And what I want to do today is basically go through the book. So I walk you through the book, and as I said, it will be very quick. So it's 400 pages in 20 minutes by now, I think. Maybe I get some bonus minutes. Cool. So I will really very briefly focus on some points. So I'll try to sort of go through all the chapters in a very, very quick way. And the book basically exists of these four main sections. So there's a section on the history of the park. Well, it's mostly one chapter actually. Then there's a section on the abiotic and biotic template of the park. There's a section about some of the theoretical advances. So let's say the scientific advances that came out of this park that have been of global significance. And then there's a final section where science and management meet. So that's also the outline of my talk. So let's start with a very brief history. If we talk about history, some of the earliest writings about HIP's history, or at least the region where HIP is now situated, start from these, especially some of the work by Penner in the 1970s. So he was an archaeologist, and he mapped and looked into some of the early archaeological findings in the HIP region. And one of the things he did is create a map with findings of rock art sites, for example, and also early Stone Age tool finding sites. And some of these tools go back at least 45,000 years. So HIP obviously is a very long history, also a very long human history. And the first recorded evidence for Iron Age farmers goes back to the 7th century. So that's also well, about 1400 years ago, and this is the recorded evidence, so it's likely goes back a bit longer than that. Then there has been some very nice work in the park that was done on the impact of these early humans is not the correct word, but these early inhabitants of the HIP region. For example, this work by Martin Hall. We looked at, for example, woody vegetation impact, so the impact of iron melting on some of the woody communities in the HIP region. This is an example of work by Jim Feely, where he looked at former homesteads that had been abandoned, and these homesteads go back from anywhere between 60, 70 years to several hundreds of years, at least. And he actually showed that some of the vegetation patterns that we see nowadays in the park go back to this former human land use. So I can't really go into all the details, unfortunately. So I'm just skimming through sort of some of the main aspects of the book. But this was a very interesting finding, because he also showed that some of the current large herbivores, like white rhino, actually use some of these former human land use spots as grazing hotspots. So some of the grazing lawns, I think many of you know this term, are situated on these former homesteads. So that was sort of the early centuries. Then came the 1800s, and this is a period of much more intensified human impact. I think, as many of you know, this was a period in South Africa of intense hunting, especially by hunters coming in from the north. And this was also the time when this area was hit very severely in terms of hunting of basically all game. And this was actually the reason, and the white rhino was actually quite central in that, because at that point in time, white rhino was already a fairly threatened species. This was one of the main reasons that people decided to go towards proclamation of this area as a protected area. At least these two then called very different reserves. So Hluhluwe Valley Reserve and Umfolozi Junction Reserve were proclaimed in 1895. And it's important to note that these parks are actually among, if not the oldest protected areas in Africa, and also among the oldest protected areas globally. So This is only a couple of years after Yellowstone was proclaimed. The Yellowstone is known as the first national park that we know. And although Kruger often thinks of themselves highly, actually HOP is a couple of years older than Kruger, which is always nice to mention. So that's basically when the conservation history, let's say the formal conservation history of HOP started in 1895. Interestingly, this was not the end of strong human impact. So people think about conservation as some people at least think about conservation as strict protection and minimizing human impact. But this was not the end of strong human impact. And one of the first things that happened after Proclamation was these tsetse eradication campaigns. So the first decades after Proclamation were focused on protecting and trying to rebuild particularly game populations, so large herbivore populations. But then came these decades of tsetse fly eradication campaigns. So this was basically focused on trying to eradicate sleeping disease. And these were massive campaigns. So these campaigns started with trying to catch as many flies as possible. And some of these old pictures are just amazing. So people were employed then to count the number of flies that were caught. So you can see there's like 176,563 flies on that pile. Right? I mean, nowadays I can't even have my students do this kind of stuff. They just refuse. But what's interesting is that this is one of the reasons why this so-called Harris fly trap was invented. So this was one of the early methods to capture these tsetse flies. Well, that capturing of flies was pretty successful in terms of number of flies, but it did not really help in terms of eradicating tsetse, the disease, and the flies actually in the end. So the next phase of these eradication campaigns were basically focused on culling the host. And you have to imagine at this point in time, this was of course under huge pressure from the neighboring farmers and the agricultural community. So lots of these conservation decisions are very understandable if you think back at the conditions that were present at that time. So the second phase of the tsetse eradication campaigns was the culling of the host. So there were massive culling campaigns of many of the large herbivore species. So you see, for example, this was basically between the 1930s and 1950s. You see, for example, bushbuck. These numbers go in total to up to 23,000, so several thousands each year. And also Great Daker, many of them were shot during these decades. If you know the park now, these numbers are actually quite amazing. If you think about the number of bushbuck that are present in HAP at the moment, for example, these are interesting numbers. Also, the reedbuck species were heavily targeted, and something like the warthog as well. Yeah, so at the bottom of these slides, I'm showing chapter numbers, but these things might go too quick. But so these culling campaigns, they lasted until sort of 1950, and then people decided that it was sort of enough. We really needed to get rid of this fly, and culling did not, in the end, also not really help. So that was the start of a massive DDT spraying campaign, where basically the whole park was sprayed with DDT, and large extents of the park were cleared in terms of bush clearing, because this fly really needs bush in terms of its reproduction and survival. And this finally really sort of got rid of the fly, at least the fly that was mostly responsible, the species that was mostly responsible for the disease. So a period of quite strong human impact, in fact, as part of a conservation scheme. So another step in the history of the reserve was then the start of the fencing of the reserve. This was a long process. It basically went from the 1940s up to the early 1970s. The northern part, Hluhluwe Game Reserve, was already fenced in the 1940s, but still open around the southern border. But the final fencing only ended sort of in 1970s. And also, Hluhluwe-iMfolozi Park, as we know it, only exists since let's say in 2012, it was proclaimed as a park entity. So up to that time, it still consisted of 3 separate parks. And the Corridor Game Reserve was only proclaimed in 1989. So it's actually quite a recent area in that sense. So over this long period of 100 years, there have been obviously many large ecological changes. And the book describes quite a few of them. Just to show 1 or 2 of them, is one of the massive changes that the park has undergone is a very strong woody encroachment. I call it woody encroachment. It's a bit of a negative connotation, but basically a colonization by woody plant species of the open grassland systems. And this is just a picture showing some of these things that, so this is a fixed point photograph 1958 and 2015, showing strong changes in woody cover. And this chapter by Carla Stever describes some of this in more detail, and also some of the possible mechanisms behind it. There have been very strong changes in the herbivore populations. This chapter by Lisa Leroux, who is actually in the room here at the moment. So if you have questions about these sorts of things, please ask Lisa. Very strong changes in the herbivore community, and one of the main changes is sort of a shift in community from a dominance of the small and medium-bodied ungulates to the large-bodied ungulates. So you can see the graph at the right. The black proportion there are the heavy-bodied, so buffalo and larger ungulates, and their proportion in the community has been increasing over time, and the proportion of anything smaller than a buffalo has been declining proportionally. So not necessarily the numbers, but as a percentage of the whole community. So that has been a big change there. Yeah, so that's sort of the first chunk of the book, which describes the history and also let's say the natural history of the park over the last century. Then we have a small section about the Abiotic and Biotic Template. So if I talk about that a bit, so HRP is situated at a quite unique spot at this sort of this gradient where you go from the coastal lowland to the higher interior plateau towards the Drakensberg. And because of this position, it's a very heterogeneous area. So it has a very heterogeneous geology and soil type composition. And because of that, partly also very, very diverse vegetation types and very quick changes across small distances. It has this very, I would say, still complete set of mammalian, I call it here, apex consumers. So consumers that are on the top of the food chain and influence ecosystems. So it has a near complete set of large carnivores and also of large herbivores, including most of the mega herbivores, which is quite unique nowadays, actually. It has a very high herbivore biomass density. So here you see HRP, Serengeti, and Kruger, and you see HRP's biomass density. So the kilograms of herbivore per square kilometer is actually the same as the Serengeti, and much, much, much higher than Kruger National Park. What's also very interesting, and Craig already mentioned that, it's sort of on the shift between semi-arid and mesic savannas. So the park has a very strong rainfall gradient from sort of 500 millimeters in the south to about 1,000 millimeters a year in the north. And because of it actually covers this shift from semi-arid to mesic savannas. And this is just some work out of Sally Archibald's chapter where she shows the importance of fire in terms of median percentage burned on the right axis, and the importance of herbivore density, or of herbivores, this is in terms of herbivore density. And you can see that the relative importance of herbivory and fire actually shifts along the rainfall gradient. So fire becomes more important in wetter systems, and herbivores become more important in relatively dry systems. And HRP is really sort of right in the middle of this shift. So it's very interesting if you're interested in the relative roles of fire and herbivory. So this is really, because of all these different reasons, HRP is really an exceptional natural laboratory for science. And particularly if you're interested in the role of top-down consumers, so fire and herbivory, versus bottom-up drivers, such as resources like rainfall and nutrients. And I think partly due to this, but also due to other reasons, HRP has been very influential in the science of ecology, definitely in terms of savanna ecology, but I would say in ecology in general. And I want to just briefly mention two of the main, let's say, chunks of theory that have come out of this park that by now have been influencing science anywhere in the world. And also these two scientists that have been behind developing these theories. So William Bond, first of all, and Norman Owen Smith, secondly. I think they have, I was going to say dinosaurs, but that's maybe not a very respectful term. But, they are really key figures in terms of ecology and HIP. And I would say ecology in South Africa, obviously, as most of you should know. So I want to pay my respect to these two scientists while standing here. So these two pieces of theory have been very influential, and just to very briefly go into them, but the book is then actually has a couple of chapters that deal with this work. William Bond has really been very influential in what he calls his demographic bottleneck model. So this model has been developed partly from work in HIP, and by now it has been much further developed, but the principle of this model is basically that you look at tree recruitment through demographic bottlenecks. So basically when a tree goes from seed to seedling and from seedling to sapling, it faces these bottlenecks for moving from because it wants to move from the one step to the next step. And these bottlenecks are created by fire and herbivory. Fire and herbivory can keep trees in certain age classes or height classes. And that would then be called a fire or a browse trap. But the resources on the other end, so water, nutrients, and light, can influence the extent to what trees are trapped in these bottlenecks, because they influence the growth speed of the tree. And they also influence the extent of fire and herbivory. So sort of this very simple conceptual model has become a very nice way of studying how trees, basically the drivers of tree cover and of vegetation dynamics, of tree life history, etc., etc. Yeah, this is a chapter by William Bond, goes into much more detail. But as I said, this model has become very influential globally as well. One of the more recent effects that it has had is that it has been challenging our view of biomes. And it has been basically saying that biomes should no longer be seen as abiotically driven units, so basically climate-driven units. So we have all been brought up, at least I've been brought up, with the knowledge that biomes are determined by climate. You know, rainfall, temperature, they determine whether you have a forest or a savanna or a grassland or etc., etc. This demographic bottleneck model has led to science that's challenging this model and is basically saying, yes, environmental drivers are important, but biomes are actually, to a large extent, consumer-driven. So consumers such as fire and herbivory determine to a much larger extent where you have forest and savanna and grassland. And this is just a complicated diagram, but it's also showing, and there's a chapter on this topic, that you can use plant traits then to actually define biomes. So plant traits that reflect an adaptation to fire or to herbivory, for example. This is, I think, one of my favorite chapters because it's so revolutionary, especially in the northern hemisphere. There's also some work in the book on consumer-driven biomes, such as consumer-driven grassland systems. So consumer, in this case, I mean fire and herbivory again. And for example, these well-known grazing lawns, which are grassland types that are driven by herbivory, obviously, but are very special in terms of species composition and functional ecology. So as I said, this sort of thinking about consumers in a different way has become very influential, and it's now increasingly influencing how we think about systems in the north as well. Then another influential concept is the mega herbivore concept by Norman Owen Smith. And I think most of you are aware of this work. So herbivores that are at least 1,000 kilograms as an adult, and because of that they escape non-human predation. They have a very high tolerance for low quality food, and they also have very long gestation times. And because of all these different characters, they have a disproportionately strong impact on ecosystems. So Norman's work has also become extremely influential globally, and there's now hundreds and hundreds of papers every year that cite this mega herbivore concept, going from marine systems to terrestrial systems to understanding extinct megafauna to understanding the role of deer species in Europe, for example. So again, highly influential and actually initiating from HIP. So then I'm going to my last section because I have to hurry up a bit, I see. So this is very much about, and this is basically the second half of the book, and I would say maybe the core of the book, because I think this is where HIP has also really has been contributing enormously, and this is where science and conservation management meet. So I will show you a couple of examples of how science has been contributing to concrete practical applications in conservation management. And these 4 different examples basically are related to managing herbivore populations in small reserves, to applications of fire, to disease control programs, and to invasive alien plant control. So firstly, managing herbivore populations in small reserves. This is really a theme that HIP has been very, very central in many different ways. Already from the let's say 1950s, or at least basically from the start, actually. And it has gone through many different phases. So I already talked a bit about the disease control programs. So that's one example, right? So in the early days, there was this massive culling of ungulates to control a disease. And that was actually not really successful in the end. So that was a lesson, because they needed to use other methods to get rid of this disease. And DDT spraying was actually in the end the most successful, though a bit painful perhaps, method. Another culling phase actually came a bit later. It started sort of in the 1950s, or late 1950s, and it lasted until 1980, basically 85. And this was focused on managing herbivore populations in small reserves and following like an agriculturally based veld management approach. So this came out of science. This came out of rangeland management, basically, and it used sort of agricultural concepts and applied them to a game reserve. And that led to very heavy culling campaigns of particularly short grass grazers. So grazers such as wildebeest and impala. I highlighted them in yellow here. Zebra and warthog were heavily culled during the 60s and 70s, because there was this reflection of too much short grass in the park, basically, and the idea that would lead to erosion. And there was also visible erosion in the park. So there was heavy culling. White rhino is also there, but they were not culled by shooting them. But this was the start of the white rhino relocation program, basically. But this then, towards sort of or around the early 80s, led to this work on grassland conditions and herbivore populations, and basically to the observation that this culling had not led to the responses that people expected when a severe drought hit the system. So mortality during this drought was not as high as actually was expected. And this then led to actually a complete new paradigm where people realized this agriculturally based carrying capacity idea does not fit the types of animals that we talk about. And we need to move to a new paradigm, which then started around 85 and looked at it was a natural process-based population management. And for example, they started using rainfall much more carefully in terms of determining the offtake. But this was also the period of large carnivore reintroductions. So it sort of went hand in hand with restoring the large carnivore populations. So lions were reintroduced in the 1960s, wild dog in the 1980s, and cheetah in the 1960s as well. There's detailed information about this whole process in Michael Sommer's chapter. Very interesting, I think, if you're interested in large carnivore management, also from a genetic point of view. This then actually led to a sort of a re-establishment of the predator-prey dynamics, or at least I have a question mark there, because this is very much still an open question for the park at the moment. But here, and this is from the chapter by Lisa, basically you see in the top right corner a strong increase of the large carnivores since the early 2000s. So this is wild dog and lion. And at the same time, we've been seeing pretty strong declines of the small-bodied and the intermediate-bodied species. While actually the large-bodied species kept on increasing. So this is a very correlative evidence, or maybe it's not even evidence, but it suggests at least towards an effect of predation on these smaller species. What we've also seen over a bit longer period of time already is the really dramatic declines of the small antelopes. And I'm talking about reedbuck and smaller. So reedbuck, some of the duiker species, but also steenbuck, and bushbuck as well. I think I forgot some, but these 8 or 9 species have all very strongly declined since the early days, and are now at very low numbers. Yeah, we actually did a paper recently where we looked into some of the mechanisms which might include predation, but also woody encroachment. Then process-based management of mega herbivore populations. That has also been obviously something that HIP has been very influential in. And the most famous example is this Operation Rhino, of course, where HIP has been solely responsible for saving the white rhino from extinction, and where actually all of the white rhino that we still have now in the world, except for very few individuals, originate from HIP. There's also a very nice chapter in there which also talks about black rhino management, so the contrast between black rhino and white rhino management, for example. If you think about white rhino management, the park has been developing this so-called dispersal sink management. So, because one of the main questions was, when they started removing rhino, remember that before the 1980s there was quite heavy removal because there was this agriculturally based paradigm, right? But in 1985 they were like, okay, we have to stop removing fewer animals, including rhino, but what kind of natural process should we be using to decide how many rhino to remove? That's when Norman Owen Smith's thesis, so he did a thesis on the behavioral ecology of white rhino, actually led to the development of this so-called sink management. And the sink management basically means that you have a core area where you leave the rhino alone, and that's surrounded by sink areas, and these are the areas where you actually remove rhino. But you sort of let the rhino decide, because you only remove rhino that appear in the sink area and they come from the core area. So you let the system in the core area decide in terms of natural dispersal of white rhino, how many rhino you remove. So that's a bit the core of this sink management, which is a very nice example of how science and management meet, I think. And this is still running now as we speak. HFP, I think, might also become influential in elephant management, and it is already, of course, right in the middle there. It's facing as many small areas around Africa, or especially South Africa. It's facing a rapidly increasing elephant population. The elephants were reintroduced there in the, what was it, I think the 60s? No, sorry, 80s, of course, early 1980s. They were brought back in the early 1980s. Then they very strongly increased. And now there's work ongoing in HFP on, for example, immunocontraception. How can we use contraception to manage the elephant population? And there's also ongoing development of so-called management action tables. How do we actually think about elephant management? And how do we make that concrete in terms of our objectives as a park, how that links to elephant management? So I think, yeah, and lots of the details are in, I have 3 minutes left, okay. Fire, so this very much links to this demographic bottleneck model, because this model has now been giving us concrete tools in terms of thinking about the roles of fire in tree recruitment. And basically this deals with things like fire intensity and fire return interval, and thinking about these fire traits in terms of tree recruitment, and then actually, and this chapter by Sally Archibald is full of this kind of information. How can we use that information to create a manager's toolbox? And over the last couple of decades in HFP, this is also an example of something that basically has gone hand in hand between scientists and managers through informal meetings, where some of the results out of research actually trickled into management. HFP has had several large disease control programs. The Buffalo TB program is one example, which has been quite successful. So there has been, yeah, the left side shows some regions in the park with a percentage of TB prevalence in buffalo populations, ranging up to 20% almost, I think. And this Buffalo TB control program, which was really a collaboration between science and management, led to quite strong declines of TB prevalence in most of the areas of the park. Finally, I want to mention this alien plant control. And I think some people, maybe many of you that know the park from maybe, let's go back 5, 6, or 10 years ago, they know these pictures where you saw walls and walls of this plant called Chromalina odorata, or triffid weed. And especially the northern part of the park was just covered by Chromalina. When you would be driving over the roads, you would just see walls of Chromalina. And if you were lucky, you would see a buffalo standing in front of the Chromalina, but quite often they were standing behind the Chromalina, obviously. One example of a management science collaboration has been this large field scale experiment where Mariska Tebes, together with some of the managers, tried out several control measures in terms of burning Chromalina and cutting Chromalina. And this has become a very effective method to control Chromalina. So some final reflections. I'm ending here. And these are some of the things that we mention in the synthesis of the book. I think one of the interesting things that comes out of the book is that humans have been very influential in HRP. And not just recent humans, but you actually go back thousands and thousands 10,000s of years. And HAP also has been the first park in Africa where this wilderness concept has been implemented. So part of the area is conserved as a wilderness area. And we discuss in the synthesis is how do we now actually see humans as part of this wilderness? Because obviously we have been an important part of it for a very, very long time, and some of our effects have been beneficial in terms of biodiversity. But obviously it's all about the extent of human impact. I have to stop now, but I want to just mention one last thing. This is the current conservation challenges that we are meeting. Because I've been I've mentioned a lot of positive things, but we're facing right at the moment a lot of major conservation challenges, and I think some of the ones are water issues, there's almost no attention to water issues in HAP, which I think is dramatic. So I think we have serious issues with declining water flows and water quality. Persisting issues with plant invasions, or rhino poaching is one that's on the top of everybody's agenda, but maybe not even the most important one of these all, to be honest, if you think about an ecosystem functioning point of view. Still ongoing issues with wildlife diseases, and all of these things, of course, relate to managing the relationships with neighbors. And then I want to end with this one final statement, is that I think that HAP has been a very nice example of where monitoring, and this has to a large extent been state-funded monitoring, has met external science, and has actually come up with many, many examples of conservation management, or how to practice conservation management. And I think now actually we live under a time where a lot of this state-funded monitoring is under severe threat. And although I'm now over my time, I want to sort of repeat that again, because I think it makes me sad if I'm working now in HAP and I see some of these things happening that are happening at the moment. And I really want to stress while standing here that we really have to safeguard this place and also safeguard this aspect of long-term monitoring in relation to management. That was it, I think, then. Thank you for your patience.